Hello, and welcome to Salon Lockdown, which is a series of big salons that we've been doing since lockdown to really get us together with some of the big ideas that we've got sort of time and a bit of space perhaps to consider while we've got lockdown. For those of you who haven't met me before, I'm Helen Bagnall, the founder of Salon London, and the co-founder with Dickon Towns, who's producing the salon tonight, and Juliet Russell. And, everything that we've done with Salon London is to really get us together with people, with academics, with experts, with authors who've got these really big ideas that can really, by helping us understand their work, can really benefit our lives and the effect that we have in our lives. And I think tonight is so excellent in that respect. For those of you who were at Digital also, you might have heard that, one of the big themes that kept coming through in all the talks was that perhaps post-lockdown, or as we begin to live alongside the COVID-19, that perhaps we might start to choose a slower, cheaper, less damaging lifestyle. And I think one of the big questions that I'd been thinking about around this is how much will our brain let us? And so, this is really the idea tonight. The name of the salon tonight is Why Our Brains Crave Power and Money, and we're going to be talking to Professor Tim Dalgleish about that. There's no associated book this evening, and this is more of a conversation between Tim and us to try and understand a lot more about the brain and what sort of power and control we have, and what we can do about our sort of base desires and our evolved desires and our biology, and so many things that we've covered in Salon over the 10 years. This is a kind of really interesting salon when we can kind of regroup and go in a bit deeper in kind of understanding what the power over our animal brain really, really is. Really love you to be involved if you'd like to be. We have a comment section on the site that I think you can see. Any questions, put them in, and I can put them to Tim. If you want to be anonymous, that's fine. You can also do that, and that'll just come through to me. And obviously, I won't say who is asking them. But if there's anything you want to know, this is a really good salon to get involved with. And if there are any terms or anything that you're not really comfortable with or not really understanding, I will endeavour to get Tim to explain them. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Tim Dalgleish to you. He's a clinical psychologist, and he works in the emotion group, heading up the Cognition, Emotion and Mental Health programme. And he is the director of the Cambridge Centre for Affective Disorders, and this sits within the University of Cambridge. And what it does is really, it's an entity that seeks to use cognitive therapy and innovations in neuroscience to understand and improve mental well-being across our whole lifespan. So we have got a huge amount that we can learn from Tim tonight. Hello, Tim.
Hello.
Hello. How is your lockdown?
I give it an 8 out of 10.
Oh, we're scoring it now. Tim, you may have heard me say that in the introduction. This big theme was coming through that we perhaps have got a chance post pandemic to start to really think about the way that we live, and perhaps choose, as I said, a cheaper, less damaging lifestyle. But the big question we're going to discuss tonight is, can our human desire for power and money, can that be placated?
Yeah, and that's, I think, the central to the question that a lot of us who work in evolutionary psychology and emotion have been thinking about for a long time. And I think I'd like to take an optimistic view that it can, that of course we're evolved creatures just like all the other species on the planet, but we have an enormous mental capacity. And I'd like to think that our capacity for creativity, imagination, and constructive collaboration can overcome our biological imperatives, which we've been lumbered with as a function of our evolutionary past.
It's really interesting. I think we were talking about this earlier. I think we've heard so much about our animal brain, recently, because a huge amount of mindfulness, a huge amount of dealing with the anxieties of modern life has sort of made us understand this animal part of our brain. But that's not the whole picture, is it? I'm so glad to hear that there's an optimistic view of how we can kind of work with our animal brain as well.
Yeah, I guess we have animal brains because we're animals, but what we do have is vastly different animal brains to any other animal on the planet. So in terms of our physical attributes as humans, we're not particularly different or remarkable. Maybe we've got chins, which other animals don't have, or we can walk upright, but it's nothing like being able to fly. So it's really in terms of our mental attributes that set us apart from other species, and that rightly or wrongly have allowed us to control the whole planet, to build civilizations and cultures, travel into space, curate our history, argue over our futures. All of those things are amazing capacities of the human mind, and it's our minds that really set us apart. But at the end of the day, we still have animal brains.
Right, we're going to have a good look at this. So, you spent decades getting to grips with the mind. Your career has really been all about trying to understand the human mind. So, let's get us into the mood for tonight by tell us about the brain. Paint us a picture. How great is it?
Yeah, so I suppose I just started to do that by saying the vast gap between us and our cohabitants of the planet from other species is due to this enormous mental capacity. And there are myriad ways in which the human mind is a more powerful and flexible machine than other animal minds, but I guess they could all be summed up with a notion that we're able to decouple ourselves from the here and now, from the present moment. And we do that in very, very different ways, but four ways really deserve some highlighting, I think. The first is language. So we're able to represent the world in a common currency of symbols, which we all understand. So we don't need to be in the presence of an object to be able to have a conversation about that object. So we could talk about a chicken, and we know what we're talking about. We don't need to be pointing at a chicken in front of us. So we freed ourselves from the real objects in the world, and we've got a way of decoupling and talking about that. The second is time travel, or mental time travel, which is the closest as we get to real time travel. So we're not captured by always being in the present moment. We can revisit the past, not just thinking about what happened, but we can actually almost inhabit our past memories. So we can conjure up the feelings and the thoughts and the sensations of past moments in our lives. And we can also do that about the future. We can think about what a future event might be like, how it might play out. And we can do it in ways that are either factual or even hypothetical. So we can think, well, what if I hadn't taken the car out that day and driven to Durham? Maybe things would have been completely different. We can reimagine the past and then play out different futures. So that ability to move away from the present moment, forwards and backwards in time, is a vast capacity. And along with that comes our sense of self. So for other species, one must imagine that their felt sense of selfhood, if you like, is very primitive. It's essentially a body existing in the world and moving around the world with physiological needs like hunger and thirst. But what we have is a sense of self which is a narrative across our whole lives. It's a vastly more complex sense of self which encaptures all our memories and our autobiography, our hopes, our dreams, our goals. And again, it's freed from just being in the moment to a vast timescale. And finally, we can move out of our own minds and think about how the world looks from the minds of others. So we can move away from our present into someone else's present. It's called theory of mind in psychology. So I can imagine what you might be thinking now, and that gives me an enormous advantage in evolutionary terms because I can predict what might happen. So all these different capacities allow us to move away in different ways from the moment. And ironically, of course, lots of us now are trying to recapture the ability to be in the moment. We've got our mindfulness apps and our meditation. And of course, animals just do that naturally all the time. They're always in the moment. They're never anywhere else. And yet we're desperately sometimes trying to get back to being in the moment because we have such a vast capacity to move away from being in the moment. And it's so hard to turn that off.
Oh, what a brilliant answer. Thank you so much, Tim. It really encapsulates so much of what we want to talk about. You are an expert in emotion, and so I think it's a kind of a strange question after having such a reasoned and such a clever and sort of intellectual sort of answer to my first question to you. But you actually believe that we shouldn't think too much or shouldn't feature too much on our intellect, that we really should be more in touch with our feelings. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, when I was growing up, I used to love watching Star Trek, and there you'd have Captain Kirk, who was very emotional, always followed his heart. And then there'd be Mr. Spock, who had no feelings at all, so we were led to believe, and would only make decisions on a logical basis. And they would always be putting the different sides of the argument. And that's a debate that goes back through the whole of human history, the role of passions, of feelings in guiding our decisions versus our rationality, if you like. But I think it's really quite hard to imagine what it would be like if you didn't have any feelings, because then the only way you can make decisions is if there was a really clear, logical answer to the question that you're trying to decide. And most decisions we make most of the time aren't like that. So, do I fancy a pizza for dinner or a salad? Well, you could come up with all sorts of reasons, but you'd never really get a completely logical conclusion as to what was best. But we always really know whether we feel like one thing or another. And that's because our emotions give us a very rich understanding of what we've enjoyed in the past, what we haven't enjoyed in the past, and they help us navigate most of the decisions in the day to day. And if you turned them off, I think we would be completely floundering and find it very difficult to decide to do anything.
But do you think that we are just over reliant on trying to find these reasons though? And example you give of pizza or a salad is, it doesn't really matter. But if we're trying to find logic in really big kind of decisions that affect our lives and not allowing for the emotions, are we causing difficulties for ourselves?
Yeah, so I think both the ability to think and reason and the ability to feel and intuit are both good tools but bad masters. And I guess historically the idea has been, oh, emotions are bad, they're irrational, reason and thinking are good. But I think that's a complete misconception. And we all know that sometimes we felt like we've had a situation where we say, this just doesn't feel right to me, but I can't really reason why. And it turns out that there was something wrong. Or alternatively, we say, well, this feels completely the right thing to do. And then intellectually, you think maybe I shouldn't do it, and you do it, and then it was a disastrous decision. So both can go wrong. Thinking and feeling can lead us in the wrong direction. But if we understand what our feelings are telling us and understand the biases in the way we think, then they're both really important tools. But what you don't want to do is always go with your gut feeling or always ignore your feelings. It's best to try and understand yourself and how you can harness those two powerful forces and bring them to bear on each decision you make.
It was really interesting. We did a salon last year with really different discipline, and the speaker said, we lack the language to really be able to explain how we feel. So we feel the emotions, but because we're not very good at talking about emotions or explaining how we feel about things, we tend to miscategorize them. Which is why so many people tend to find, that their response is, well, I feel guilty, I feel anger, I feel, because they have a short amount of emotion, a small amount of emotions that they can identify. And actually, we really need to think much more about what we actually feel and what that emotion is and be able to explain it, to be able to communicate much better.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we were saying about the chickens. If I say a chicken, you know what I mean, because we've learned that certain shapes in the world that flap and make noises and do all those things are called chickens. They've got quite a reliable mapping of the word onto the object. But when it comes to our own feelings, the mapping's much more blurry around the edges. So we do have words that we understand. So you think to yourself, well, I'm feeling sad. And that's because the combination of kind of thoughts and feelings that goes with that label has occurred many times in often very similar circumstances. So we've developed a concept of feeling sad, just like we've developed a concept of what a chicken is. But a lot of the feelings are a bit more difficult to pin down. And it's only when they crystallize into those very clear emotions that we can label them. But actually, we're feeling things all the time. It's never turned off. At any one time, we can shut our eyes and we'll be feeling more or less good or bad, and more or less agitated or calm, somewhere in that space. And only occasionally does it crystallize into something that we can really reliably label. And like you say, people vary in their ability to do that. But we're feeling all of the time. So I like to think of it as there's emotions like sadness and anger, but underneath there's this kind of affective flow that we're always surfing. And only occasionally are we able to pinpoint it with an exact word, but it's never missing from our experience.
Right, okay, I see what you mean. And that's what you mean about this affective flow, is just keeping an eye on where our emotions are and sort of like knowing what that's telling you. There's a lot of creative people in our audience, a lot of creative people at Salon. I just, before we move on, I just wanted to say, is it that, I think I really want to support creative communities, particularly at the moment. And I just think, is there an argument to say that being more in touch with your feeling, really kind of understanding what these feelings are telling you, can they help with our capacity for imagination, for creativity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on being creative, but I suppose it feels to me that a key part of being creative is understanding the emotional or affective impact of what you're creating. So if someone said they wrote a book or composed a piece of music, and the response was, well, I understand logically or rationally that that's good, but it didn't make me feel a thing, then I imagine they'd be pretty disappointed. And so I think, being able to somehow be in touch of what the emotional impact of what you're doing is on the people who are receiving it is absolutely critical. And I mean, for example, if Wordsworth had written I walked about a bit on my own, he probably wouldn't be revered as much as writing I wandered lonely as a cloud. The intellectual, the information in those two sentences is identical, but the second one has rhythm and meanings which has an emotional impact, which the first one doesn't. And some people are able to tap into what that is, which makes them great poets. And other people like me are unable to do that.
Well, you say, you can't talk about creativity, but I guess what I'm saying is that, imagining futures, imagining how we might live, in the future, imagining new ways and new systems. If you're very used to tuning into those emotions and explaining it, I was thinking it was that it feeds into that ability to be able to imagine. But we will come back to that, I think. I was really interested to hear you say that you're, fundamentally optimistic about humanity and our ability to overcome our animal brain. And I just wanted to ask you, in your opinion, it seems like you've explained really clearly the potential within us and in our brains and ourselves as humans is just astonishing. Our capacity and ability to think is unlike any other animal. You would think with all of that our levels of happiness and contentment would be really high. Are they?
Yeah. And that's where the optimism comes from. But I guess everyone knows from their own lives, but just looking around, now's not the best time to look around, I guess, during a global pandemic. But even before that, we have a world full of tribalism, war, famine, inequality, discord, miscontent. And I think that's the fundamental challenge. How does a species with such capacity for collaboration, for culture, for civilization, for refinement, end up with a world that's like that? I mean, it's a bit black and white, but obviously there's lots of good things in the world as well. And I think the answer to that is that we didn't design the world and our civilization from scratch. It evolved and it grew organically. Maybe if we were to sit down and design a civilization full of people with the mental capabilities that we've got, we wouldn't have nation states, for example, with their capacity for war and tribalism. Maybe we would have collaborative global political systems where half the people weren't starving and half were ridiculously wealthy. We probably wouldn't design a world like the one we've ended up evolving culturally into. But it is what it is. And so I realize that saying I wouldn't start from there isn't a great answer, but one has to think how to move forward.
It's not too late, and I think that's what we want to come on to a bit later. I think you've explained that, we've realized that the older animal brain has a lot of power. But I think what I hadn't realized until I was reading your work is that, in kind of almost placating that animal part of our brain or those drivers, we developed what you call these additional drivers or these additional priorities, which you call surrogate priorities. And I wondered if you could explain what they were.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the first thing to say is, it's a little bit of an explanation, but the first thing to say is all of these wonderful capacities of the human mind did not evolve for our enjoyment and our pleasure and our ability to compose music and build great buildings. They evolved because they helped us in the evolutionary competition. So they evolved because they maximized our chances of surviving and reproducing. That's the only currency that evolution cares about. It's just a bonus that we can do all these other things, and maybe try to aspire to move beyond our biology. So if you think about a predator that wants to find some prey, you could wander around and see if you meet any prey. But if you could model the world and think, well, I understand that the prey go to a waterhole, then suddenly you're able to predict the world better than the predator who just wanders around. So you'll have an evolutionary advantage. And then if you think, well, actually they only go to the waterhole in the mornings, so you've got a more complicated prediction model. And then you think, well, they only go to that waterhole in the dry season and that waterhole in the rainy season. So this ability to be able to predict and model the world in more and more sophisticated ways over longer and longer periods of time has a massive evolutionary advantage because it allows you to survive. You get more to eat, more to drink. You can predict the things that are going to hurt you. So that's why eventually we've been able to decouple ourselves from the present moment to build these massive prediction models about our future to give us this optimal survival strategy. And so given all of that, then you think, well, how can we make a system that is so good at predicting all of these things to do with survival even better? And one way to do it is to say, well, imagine if you only had to predict one thing instead of lots of things, where the food is, where the safety is, where the shelter is, where the warmth is. Maybe you just have to predict one thing. So for example, territory would be an example of that. So if you could control having the biggest territory and you just know, well, that's naturally going to give you food and access to mates and so on. All you have to worry about is keeping your territory and controlling it. You don't have to, everything else will just flow naturally from that. And if there are things like that, so what we're calling surrogates, then evolution will prioritize those as well. And I think for humans, there's two very powerful ones which have driven a lot of our evolution. The first is a need for social affiliation and relatedness. And the second is a need for social status. Because if you can be part of a social group as opposed to an individual, then you have a much greater evolutionary advantage over any one person on their own. So there's a strong evolved need to belong and be part of a group. And the more status you have in that group, the more food, access to mates and so on you have. And so there's a strong evolved need to pursue status. And by status, I mean the trappings of status as well, such as wealth and resources. So within us, we've got this drive for these survival surrogates, social status and wealth and social affiliation, which have kind of trumped the more basic survival needs because they're easier to control.
Okay.
That's a long answer.
No, it's a great answer. And just so I've understood it, so, our physical survival is assured. And it's assured by the fact that we are working in groups and that, by being in groups, we can kind of outsource those really primitive needs to a wider society. The difficulty that we get from transcending that is that we are then become very fixated, or we then have huge currency on status and wealth. And I think you mentioned attractiveness as well.
Yeah. So if you imagine that, you have these sort of psychological motivations that are very evolved and biological to pursue status, to be attractive to the opposite sex, but also to these other ones to eat and drink and so on. But you get to a point where social evolution and cultural evolution has meant that actually those things aren't necessarily matters of life and death anymore. So evolution gave us the motivation to pursue them because they were the difference between living and dying. But now, because we've kind of outsourced a lot of those things to our broader society and culture, so for most people on the planet, not everybody, and certainly not at this current time, having enough to eat, having enough to drink, being safe, meeting members of the opposite sex, being part of a social group, and even your status within that group are no longer matters of life and death. So essentially, you've got a set of imperatives that have evolved to be matters of life and death, which have feelings around being a matter of life and death attached to them, but actually they no longer have that kind of jeopardy. So the question is, can we move beyond those imperatives, no longer worry about wealth, status, attractiveness, power, dominance, all of those things that used to mean the difference between whether we survived or didn't survive? Now they no longer mean that for most of us. Can we put them behind us and move to a higher level where we think about what does matter and what is important in a very different way?
Yeah, I think, and can we? I think that is the question to you. Can I make coming to tonight's salon as high value as a yacht in Ibiza? As high status, as high...
Because it's online, you can come to the salon and still be on.
But can I make the value, the perceived value, can it become, could doing something like this become a status symbol? Could how much you care about the planet, how much you want to become involved in citizen assemblies, in rebuilding a different way of living, could that become a status symbol? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think that's a really key question. So I think the answer is, if we've got a very strong set of biological imperatives which highlight the importance of, say, status and wealth and achievement and power, and the importance of our group versus the other groups, so tribalism, in-groups and out-groups, competition, war, aggression. If those things are very, very grounded in our evolutionary past, then if we don't work hard, either individually or as communities or as nations or cultures, to replace those biological values with a different set of values, then nature will abhor that vacuum. And that will be the themes that dominate individual and social experience. Am I better than the next person? Am I achieving more? Am I wealthier? Am I more attractive? What's my status rating? Those things will just tend to prevail if we don't effortfully replace them with something more virtuous, for want of a better word.
And that relates to a point you were making earlier. And so that's where we are now. We've outstripped the basic survival, but because these social and cultural structures that have come out, unorganized, as you say, but have kind of how we've moved forward from our sort of animal survival instincts into this area where it's now, where we're kind of we do have these social and cultural sort of social and cultural, what do you put it as? These social and cultural social and cultural clocks, you say? Oh, social.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So I think
I'm glad.
if you think about evolution as biological and psychological evolution, and then cultural evolution as different things. So essentially our biological evolution is almost ground to a halt.
Right, okay. Tim said it, it's done.
But we each individual carries that biological heritage inside them. And then our cultural evolution has been going on and continues to develop. But of course, the cultural evolution is shaped by the very biological roots of all of the individuals making up that culture. So cultural evolution is our way out of our biological past. But in a sense, it's got one arm tied behind its back, because the very nature of our culture has been determined by the biological imperatives that we bring as individuals to that culture. And so for many hundreds and thousands of years, the need to have social groups and status and power and wealth in order to survive was so predominant. And it's only relatively recently that for many of us, have outgrown those immediate needs and have the capacity to replace them with something different.
Okay.
So I always think a good example of cultural evolution is if you think of someone like Socrates, who was the wisest man in ancient Greece, arguably, and probably knew everything that there was to know as a human being, probably knew all the knowledge there was. And if you imagine Socrates was out walking his dog one day, and then you imagine a 10-year-old child now under lockdown taking their dog out for a walk. If you looked at the experience of the world of those two dogs, they wouldn't be any different, thousands of years apart. But actually, that 10-year-old child would know more about the world than Socrates knew. And that's cultural evolution. And what that child knows about the world is some minuscule percent of all there is to know, whereas Socrates probably knew everything there was to know in terms of information. So our cultural evolution over the last few thousand years has been vast, but it's very much been shaped by those biological themes of power and tribalism and wealth. And it's really trying to allow cultural evolution to outgrow its biological roots. And it's early days.
It's early days, and it's not as simple as saying, okay, well, I'm just not going to respect wealth, or I'm not going to respond to status, or, I'm not going to like my group more than the out group. That's just not possible, is it?
Because it's like saying I'm no longer going to feel hungry or thirsty or have a sex drive or shiver when it's cold. These things are, I really think these things are biologically rooted and evolved. And so I think lots of thinkers in the past have come up with metaphors. So the Buddha had a good one, which is it's like riding an elephant. So the elephant rider is the kind of mind that's able to think, I'm not going to give way to those urges. But the elephant is the desire for status and love from our peers and power and prestige. And you're having to drive that elephant, and it's really not completely in your control. And obviously there's other metaphors, the Incredible Hulk, the beast within. Freud had a sort of multi-partite mind of an id and an ego. So this idea of an internal battle where you're fighting the very ancestral urges, some of which are very primitive, but some actually are quite sophisticated, like the motivation to acquire status, is a good one. Rather than thinking, well, I'm just gonna put all that behind me now. That it's not that simple, alas.
But you work, you have a big clinical side to your work, and so you do specialize in changing our actions or people's actions, and you are really practice in enabling substantive change in the minds of your patients, really allowing them to make important changes in their life. Is there anything that we can learn from the clinical side of your work in terms of rethinking our behavior or how we want to live?
Yeah, wow, what a big question. I suppose I feel like we should understand that struggling with mental health is just essentially very normal. Just like all of us will feel ill different times in our lives, then all of us are going to feel in mental duress at different times in our lives. And all the recent research says that essentially, even if you think of a clinical level of mental distress, most people will meet criteria for that at some times in their lives. So I think one thing is to think that mental health difficulties are completely normal. And then the challenges are really, how do you help people who've got mental health problems? But more importantly, how do you try and prevent them and mitigate them in the first place, which I think is where you're coming from. And I think it's that vacuum I was talking about earlier. So I think what we were saying was there's these sort of biologically grounded imperatives, some of which are about status and power and wealth and in-groups and out-groups. And we have to try and have those under our control and rise above them as much as we can. And for many centuries, the value system that tried to sit above those was provided to us by organized religion. And so for most people, when they look to find a different set of values, other than those ones that are biologically grounded, they were there readily available for them. But actually, I think we're in an increasingly secular world, especially in the West. But there's been no real attempt to foster for individuals and for communities and societies an ability to think about what those higher values might be in the absence of a guiding set of principles from any kind of organized religion. And I think that kind of thing would be really helpful in preventing people getting sucked into these these concerns about status and appearance and wealth and so on, to try and think about what would constitute a life well lived. What are the values and the virtues by which I want to live my own life? And that kind of education and discussion is really absent from most discourse these days, I think.
So, just so that I've understood, so is it as simple as, you can't actually help craving status and wealth, because and you can't help craving status and power and being part of the group, but the difficulty of that is there isn't very much of that to go around. Everyone's chasing the same desire, for a small amount of power and a small amount of status by the nature of what they are. So, are you saying that, to really, I think was the idea of this talk, is to really say, can we placate that aim? Can we placate those urges? Not really, no. But are you saying that you can, transcend them to a certain degree by beginning to think about how you want to live your life and what set of values do you want to live by?
Yeah, I suppose I'm optimistically saying if there was a discourse and a currency around what constitutes a life well lived, a set of values that would be beneficial for all, that are collaborative, that are positive, would they be the same as the concerns that we would naturally come to our minds if we never tried to put those things in place? And I think perhaps for some people they would decide, well, this is the kind of life I want to live. But I think for a lot of people, it would reflect this battle between, not being able to turn off those desires for status and wealth and being attractive and finding it rewarding when this happens and that happens. They would find that those values are different from the ones that they would come up with if we were able to cultivate a different discourse. But you're right, it's always going to be an internal battle for every person, and I think that's where a lot of mental health problems arise.
Do you?
Yeah.
The gap between the two?
I think so. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but I think, I think a lot of people find it. Well, it goes back to what we said before. These aren't mild feelings. We have an affective and an emotional system that was evolved to deal with matters of life and death. So we've got our life and death system of feelings attached to these biological imperatives around status, when in fact they're not matters of life and death. And so if someone doesn't invite you to their party, you're a 17-year-old and you don't get invited to the party and everyone else is going, that's not a matter of life and death. But actually, in an evolutionary sense, you're in danger of not being in your social group, which is very dangerous. And so the feelings that go along with that are massively often disproportionate to the reality of the jeopardy involved. So we have to somehow manage that we've got this evolved system that's giving us all of these big, strong affective surges to events in our lives that aren't the matters of life and death that those emotional systems evolved to deal with. And how do we manage those feelings? And I think a lot of it is to think about the sorts of things that press those buttons and whether they're really congruent with the values that we'd like to be living our lives by.
Okay. It has been an unusual few months. And, I think a lot of people have begun to think about the way that they do live and, perhaps are beginning to have, there's a world of difference in the way that we've all experienced these months. And, there are so many different experiences through it. I can't possibly speak, across them. But there has been this feeling, and certainly within the festival, there was definitely this feeling that, this is perhaps a time to think about how we could live differently. And, just wondered if is this a good time to be thinking about how we can change how we live, and can we take
Yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from, that it feels a bit uncomfortable talking about silver linings when so much pain and distress has been caused by this situation. But I guess, assuming that we all appreciate that that's happened, there are some potential silver linings. So, and I think they cross all of those levels we've talked about, the global, the political, right down to the individual. So I think, I mean, it's very unusual or possibly unprecedented to have a stressor that has global implications for every person on the planet that has to be dealt with immediately. And of course, we have a massive global stressor that doesn't seem to create that same sense of urgency in climate change. But the pandemic has perhaps realized where the barriers and drivers are as a global community to dealing with something that affects all of us. And I'd like to think that some positive things have come out of that. One might be an appreciation of good leadership. I don't know, excuse me being political, but I wonder how many Americans would rather President Obama was in charge than President Trump, whatever their political affiliation. And an appreciation of good leadership, an appreciation of expertise and scientific expertise, which certainly in recent years has been very devalued. I think Michael Gove was saying we don't have any time for experts anymore. Who cares what they think? And I think a notion of collaborative effort, global collaborative effort around vaccines and solutions. All of these things potentially are positive aspects of the future. And then right down to the individual, a rediscovery of the importance of social connections, of slowing down, of perhaps wondering at an individual level how much of life is this pursuit of status and achievement and wealth and getting to the next stage, getting to the next prize, and whether that's really the healthiest way to live one's life. So I think at all levels there's a time for reflection. That said, it could be within 2 weeks of the pandemic ending, we'll be exactly back where we started. But who knows? You can just be optimistic.
Yeah, I think we work with a lot of academics and writers, incredible people over the year, and all the best ones are optimistic and hopeful. It just is. It's just something we've noticed over the last 12 years. And
I was going to say to that, Helen, I think there's a generational thing as well. And one thing about cultural evolution is that generations die out and new generations come along. And I've got teenagers, and I spend a lot of time with young people, and I have a massive amount of respect and optimism about their generation. I think they see the world in a slightly different way, and people like Greta Thunberg have captured a whole planet's consciousness. And I think the good thing about generations is old views can die out and new views can take hold, and that can actually happen quite fast. Some of the horrible, racism, gender inequality of the 20th century, although it's not eliminated, it's very, very different now. And in evolutionary terms, that's the blink of an eye. And so I do hope that our capacity for collaboration, humanity, to move beyond our inner turmoil, our biological imperatives, will prevail in the end.
It's not easy, but it is possible.
Yes.
And I think, what we have seen in this short time is everything we were told before about how the world has to work isn't actually that true. And if we've seen it in our generation, the younger generation that you're talking about, your children have seen it absolutely. And that opens up lots of possibilities, just as we moved on from those, very primal survival urges to social and cultural systems, we can move on again to more interesting, more beneficial, more hopeful systems, right?
Absolutely.
And I think this comes back to, my question to you about imagination and creativity. Although you're saying, well, it's not my field, I think, as as a group who works with a lot of creative people, the more practiced your ability is to think of interesting ways of working, of collaborating, of being involved in developing new systems, of tackling climate change and the climate emergency, the better it's going to be, right?
Indeed, yes. I think this enormous capacity of the human mind should give us all hope. It seems like the capabilities are infinite. We have one planet, we share it with lots of other creatures, and in principle, if we put our collaborative minds together, we should make that a harmonious and wonderful place to exist in. But I think we're quite near the beginning of that cultural journey, but we're definitely on that journey, I'd like to think.
Okay, it's brilliant. And and just before I go to questions, and and I think just want to re-emphasize the point you said that it is a good idea for us to think, in an increasingly secular society, what constitutes a well-lived life, because that will help in understanding how we want life to be organized.
That's right. I mean, it goes right back to the beginning of our discussion, which is how do you make decisions in the day-to-day? And your affective system your emotional system will guide you in those decisions, but it'll guide you based on your own values. You kind of set your life running with a set of values. And if you don't think carefully about what those values will be, then your culture and your biology will determine them for you, and will say, well, you're going to achieve as much as you can, you're going to strive, you're going to earn as much money, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, you're going to get married at this age, you're going to retire at that age. There's a script that will fill the space, and maybe that script is fine for some people, maybe it's not, but I think we all owe it to ourselves to sit back and think, well, what are my values? And even if it's something as simple as, well, I just want to leave this planet with my little corner of it in a slightly better state than when I arrived. It doesn't. I think it all just bears thinking about for each and every one of us. What kind of life do we want to live, and how do we want to live it? And then everything flows from that.
Do the thinking, work it out, or otherwise you're going to default to wanting power and status. Got it. Something like that. Okay, all right. Let's take a couple of questions. Got a question from Dickon, and he says, if reproduction is a mechanism for biological evolution, what is the equivalent for cultural evolution? Well, I don't even understand the question, Tim, so you might have to define that before you answer it.
That's a really good. Well, I think what he's saying is that if there's only one currency in biological evolution, which is what attributes allow us to survive and reproduce, then what's the currency in cultural evolution? And I suppose what I've been trying to say is we have to determine that currency ourselves. And if we don't, then we'll inherit the biological evolutionary currency, which is that culture and society will develop around themes of status and wealth, and all of those themes will dominate, and unless we effortfully try to overcome them. So I'm an academic, so you would think on paper that academic life was a pure pursuit of knowledge and couldn't possibly be contaminated, but academia is riven with tribalism, jealousy, status, prizes. Even the journals we publish in have a sort of rank order, and people argue about, I got my academic, and it's even what looks like the most noble of intellectual spaces will eventually become contaminated by these human ways of dealing with things, and we continually have to watch out for that. So often an academic will publish a paper and they'll tell you which journal they published it in rather than what it was about. And we're so used to that as academics, we don't even think twice about it. But it's madness. Well, who cares which journal? It's what's in it that matters. But every system gets contaminated by these urges because, or these motivations, because they're so powerful.
Yeah, because some journals are more powerful and got more status than others. Yes. Yeah,
indeed. And status is power is all that matters, of course.
We've got a question from Leslie. Hello, Leslie. How are you? And she says, it's really, really interesting question, I think. How can you avoid the danger of lessening drive and ambition generally in the quest to be driven less towards money and power?
Oh, I think that's an excellent question. And I guess it's not about having less drive and ambition. It's having drive and ambition for the things that you think are important. And they may turn out to be status and power. That may be the conclusion some people would come to, but at least it's about doing it on your own terms. So it's not about not being ambitious. I think ambition is great, but being ambitious to do something that you think is valuable and important for whatever reason you've set yourself up to follow is different from not having thought about it at all and just really following the kind of script that society ordains for you. I think so. They're not mutually exclusive in my humble opinion.
No, I think that's a really brilliant question. Thank you, Leslie. And I'm so glad it came up because, our audience at Salon are so ambitious and they don't follow a script, and they are looking for information to use that ambition in a way that is a script that's more beneficial for as many people as possible, So it's really fantastic to cover that. And that was sort of one of the reasons I wanted to do this session with you, Tim, when we met. It's like, I think we need to understand this about power and money and drivers, because it's important with what we do.
We should aim for the stars, but they should be the stars that we decide are important for the collective good, not the stars that our ancestral evolution has told us are the ones that are critical for the survival of our ancestors thousands of years ago.
Yeah, that's our soundbite. We're going to cut that and put that out on Twitter. So we've got one question, and it's actually from someone we both know, Professor Catherine Loveday. And hello, Catherine. Hello, how are you? And she's the reason you and I met, as you know. So thank you, Catherine. And she says, Tim, is there something we can bed into the education system that would support the next generation in seeing past unhelpful primitive drives? Thank you, Catherine.
That's a fantastic question. So one thing I've been putting together is something for undergraduate type level. Obviously not everyone has the privilege of being an undergraduate, but young emerging adults, because I think that's a really good time when you're leaving the sort of bosom of your family, going out into the world, to at least sit and reflect on what your values might be and what your approach to life might be. Again, I suppose something that organized religion may well have done for a lot of people historically, and obviously for a lot of people still does. But I think it's a brilliant idea to also think about earlier in the education system as well. And I guess it's just about having a compassionate education system, which isn't all about prizes and achievement and striving. So, but it's hard to do. So one could imagine that you could say, well, why do children have to work so hard at school? Why do they have to do 7-8 hours at school and then come and have hours of homework for years and years on end? And the reason is because each country wants its children to be competitive in the international marketplace compared to other countries. So this kind of competitive, achievement-driven political and social structure just filters down to more and more pressure on young people to be ready to go out there and fight and compete in the world. So it's not as simple as just saying in an individual education system, well, actually, we'll just do things completely differently because there's more complex forces at work. But I think it has to start somewhere. So I think at least reflecting on these things and deciding whether we really need to be putting so much pressure on our young people, whether we really need to be promoting the values of achievement and status and careers and earning in the way that we are, as opposed to ambition for other things, would be brilliant. But it's hard to do.
I think you think. Thank you so much, Tim. You really have encapsulated just how hard it is, why it's so hard. But there is a massive sort of chink of possibility there, which is really exciting and really heartwarming. And and you're optimistic, and you've done the work. We should be optimistic. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to explain our relationship with status and power and money and the tough journey ahead. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thanks for inviting me. And then the salon is fantastic. So I think what you're doing is really brilliant. And I'm sure everyone listening is very grateful. People like you are making a real difference, I think.
Oh, I really hope so, Tim. And I think, the whole motivation is to really, get us some really quality information from people who are doing the work that we wouldn't have access to normally, and so that we can take it back into our own lives and be ambitious for the change we want to see if we can. So I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. Thank you so much for being part of this, conversational salon. We really wanted to look at some really difficult issues that have been running through the themes of salon for the last 10 years. I hope it's given you some hope for the future and perhaps an idea of perhaps what to think about in terms of what and the ambitions for what you want to do next. If you'd like to carry on the conversation, we're taking an almost a completely different look at our evolutionary history on Sunday when we are at our book club live, where we have a book club with the author. You don't need to have read the book, don't worry. And we're with the comedian and brilliant science writer Sarah Pascoe on Sunday. So please do join us for that if you'd like to. I'd just like to say before we go, hello to our Salon London members. Hello, particularly to our new members. Thank you so much. You really are keeping us going. And I'd like to say hello to my mum and dad in lockdown in Yorkshire. Hello. And thank you so much. This salon is now closed.